Well, hello and welcome to everyone joining us for this X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled The New Era of Project Optimus, Implications for Oncology Development Strategy. My name is Corey Stanton and I'll be your X-Talks host for this event. Today's presentation runs for approximately 60 minutes and the webinar includes an interactive Q&A session at the end. To make the most of this session, feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation and we'll try to attend to as many as possible. If you're joining us via GoToWebinar, you can use the questions chat box, which is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, please don't hesitate to contact me by sending a message using this very same chat box. And if you're viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, you can submit your questions using the comments tab on LinkedIn. Please note that all audience members are in listen-only mode and that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Catalyst Oncology, who developed the content for this presentation. Catalyst Oncology is a full-service, specialty clinical research organization built to serve the global biotech industry. As one of two established branded solutions offered by Catalyst Clinical Research, it is backed by leading retention rates and a culture rooted in its core values. Catalyst Oncology provides customers with teams experienced across all functions, knowledgeable in complex drug classes and study designs, and with data-centric methodologies that help bring next-generation therapies to cancer patients. Now, let's take a moment to meet our panelists for today's discussion. First up is Andrew Zupnik. Andrew has focused exclusively on oncology for over 20 years and serves as the Vice President of Oncology Drug Development at Catalyst Oncology. He leads Catalyst's full-service oncology solution, supporting study optimization, delivery oversight, training, and new initiatives across the commercial and operational teams to help keep Catalyst at the forefront of industry trends and cutting-edge oncology therapies. Andrew is a cell and molecular biologist with a PhD from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Science from MIT. Joining Andrew is Meredith Manuel. Meredith is a proven leader with over 30 years in the scientific industry, specializing in global drug development and project management. Over the last 30 years, she has held various positions of increasing leadership responsibilities in biopharmaceutical drug development, as well as in preclinical, regulatory, and clinical areas of business. Meredith holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Also joining us is Gilles Galland. Gilles is an oncology expert with extensive expertise in strategic cancer drug development and innovations. As Chief Development Officer at Mythic Therapeutics since 2022, he oversees clinical development, clinical operations, data management, biostatistics, regulatory affairs, safety, pharmacovigilance, clinical quality, and the development of innovative antibody-drug conjugates, or ADCs. Antibody-drug conjugates, or ADCs, rather. Previously, he was Senior Vice President, Global Head of Oncology Development at Daiichi Sankyo, where he led the clinical development and global approval of Enhertu for multiple cancer indications. And rounding out the panel is Joe Shan. Joe currently serves as Vice President of Clinical Operations at Adcentrix Therapeutics, and with nearly 3 decades of clinical and regulatory experience, Joe has spent the past 25 years focusing on oncology therapeutics, including cell therapy, radiopharmaceuticals, targeted therapies, immunotherapy, and antibody-drug conjugates, ADCs. Previously, Joe held leadership roles at MEI Pharma, Elevar Therapeutics, Kiadis Pharma, and Peregrine Pharmaceuticals. He holds an MPH in epidemiology from George Washington University and a Bachelor of Science in Physiological Sciences from UCLA. Now that we've had a chance to meet our panelists, we did just want to kick off with a couple poll questions before we launch into today's discussion. Appearing on your screen now, we have a question that you can vote on by clicking on any of the answers and hitting the submit button. And so the first question we have for you today is, how strongly do you feel that Project Optimus has impacted the oncology drug development paradigm since the start of 2023? And your options are A, significantly, B, moderately, C, some impact, or D, not at all, or E, you're just here to learn. And again, we're just looking to get a sense of who our audience is here for today's discussion and how strongly you feel that Project Optimus has impacted the oncology drug development paradigm since the start of 2023. And once again, those options are significantly, moderately, some impact, not at all, or you're just here to learn. Thank you to our audience members who have already voted. I'm going to go ahead and leave the poll open for another 10 seconds. And if you haven't had a chance to get your vote in, make sure you cast it now and hit that submit button. Looks like we're well over a majority audience vote. If you haven't had a chance to vote, you've got another 5 seconds, and then I'll go ahead and close the poll, and let's take a quick look at those results. So in terms of responding about how strongly our audience feels that Project Optimus has impacted the oncology drug development paradigm since the start of 2023, we have 26% coming in at significantly, another 26% at moderately, 15% at some impact, no votes for not at all, and 33%, a third of our audience, is just here to learn. So between significantly and moderately, that combines for our majority there, and our third still here to learn. Our next poll question that I'm going to go ahead and launch before I hand things over to the panel is, we'd like to know what aspect of oncology drug development has been impacted most by Project Optimus. So previously we asked about how much you thought Project Optimus has impacted oncology drug development, and now we'd like to know about which aspect of oncology drug development you feel has been impacted most by Project Optimus. And your options this time are longer timelines, increased cost, increased trial complexity, increased drug development planning and regulatory strategy complexity, or again, you're just here to learn. And once again, we'd like to get a sense of, in your experience, what aspect of oncology drug development has been impacted the most by Project Optimus. One more time, those options are longer timelines, increased cost, increased trial complexity, increased drug development planning and regulatory strategy complexity, or you're just here to learn. Thank you to our audience members who have currently voted. I'll leave the poll open for another few seconds to allow a majority vote to come in. So if you haven't had a chance to cast your vote, make sure you do so now. Thank you to everyone who's voted. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll at this moment, and let's take a quick peek at those results. So this time, interesting mix of results have come in. 13% suggesting longer timelines being the aspect of oncology drug development that's been impacted most by Project Optimus. 3% are minority vote at increased cost. A couple ties here at 20%, 20% for increased trial complexity, and another 20% at increased drug development planning and regulatory strategy complexity. And interestingly, our majority here, almost half the audience, 43% here to learn. So perhaps we know that Project Optimus has impacted significantly on oncology drug development, but how it has and which aspect, our audience seems like they're here to learn that. I'm going to go ahead and hide the poll results now and pass things over to Andrew to kick off the discussion. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Corey. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen in, and great to hear that we've got a lot of folks who are interested to learn, and then a wide range of opinions on the impacts and those who have seen Project Optimus impacting the oncology drug development space. So that's exactly why we're here today. Really honored to be joined by some very esteemed panelists with a ton of experience. I think combined we added up to about 100 years, guys. That's kind of old, but we can hopefully share some thoughts on what we've seen practically and really over the past year and a half, as well as I know Joe and Gilles, you've seen some of the history of what kind of spurred Project Optimus. So would love to get into that. Our method today is really just kind of a fireside chat. I'll ask a number of questions, kind of moderating, jump in to share some experiences that we've seen on my front or at Catalyst Oncology, but really look forward to hearing people's just sort of stories and case studies of what we've seen. So to kick that off, for those who are here to learn, I'm not going to go into a whole lecture on the history of oncology drug development, but for those who are curious, I thought it'd be useful to level set on just what is Project Optimus, what have we seen over the past couple of years, and how does that translate to some of the implications that we're going to be talking through today. So very briefly, you can go to the FDA website. One of the handouts that we've included is actually the recently finalized guidance for industry from the agency. And I'll just read, quoting, it's an initiative from the Oncology Center of Excellence to reform the dose optimization and dose selection paradigm in oncology drug development, right? That's the main premise here, is to just ask the industry, hey, let's stop what we've been doing and think about the best way to do drug development for oncology and to really balance dose optimization. So if you go all the way back decades, right, we started with chemotherapy, surgery, radiation, right? That's all we had at our fingertips for treating cancer patients. And in thinking about drug development and developing chemotherapies, these are toxic poisons, right? I'm a cell biologist. If you go all the way back to high school biology, these are effectively introducing double-strand DNA breaks. They're causing cell cycle arrest and apoptosis. It's effectively, the idea was, how can we get as much of this chemotherapy into patients to kill as many cancer cells as possible, right? And thus have an effect on stopping tumor progression. Fast forward today, obviously chemotherapy is still an important part of the treatment process for a number of patients, but we have targeted precision therapies. We have immunotherapies that re-energize the T cells. We've got genetically modified viruses. It's cutting edge science. As a scientist, I think some of it's really science fiction. It's amazing what we're doing. But the real question here is, do we need to retain the same paradigm around dosing patients to give them as much drug as possible? And that's the whole concept of Project Optimus to me, is the agency is saying, hey guys, you no longer are in a space where you need to give the most possible drug with the highest potential toxicity. So let's find a way that we can better balance efficacy and safety and tolerability. That's the whole premise behind this initiative. And so that has a lot of impacts, and that's what we're going to talk through today, right? We've seen that there are significant changes to study design, right? If you submit an IND with a 3+3 dose escalation design these days, it may get kicked back by the agency. We've seen a lot of newer approaches, right? There are larger sample sizes as a result, because we're looking to optimize dosing and look at different dose levels with more patients. There's more real-time sampling, longer timelines, a global aspect of earlier phase drug development. All of these are topics that I'd love to dig in today. So that's kind of level setting for those who are here to learn kind of the history and what we're gonna talk through. I'd like to unpack each of those implications. So let's kind of start with one of the earlier pieces and the guidance that's out there from the FDA. Meredith, maybe I'll start with you, because you've seen a lot of the kind of preclinical and regulatory agency interaction side of things. The guidance recommends early and often interactions with the FDA to align on dose optimization strategies. So how have you seen this play out, right? There was a historical method, that pre-IND meeting, maybe that was about it, if you even did that. What has changed now? What are you seeing in action?
No, that's a great question, Andrew, and thank you for the introduction. That was great. Yeah, I mean, historically, we saw where the pre-IND meeting was often even a perfunctory thing. Some people didn't do it. The designs were pretty standard. Things were set in stone, as you referred to earlier. The 3+3 was often the way to go, and we kind of had a path that we were going down on a regular basis. But what we've seen is, and I guess get asked this question a lot, when should I engage and what does this look like? Early and often is pretty much my answer. The sooner you can sit down and pull together what you have, understand what that pathway may look like, and engage with the agency to ensure that path forward makes sense. Because we've seen where with some of these changes, there's confusion and that additional complexity. And so rolling right into your IND and assuming that the status quo will be acceptable, it has not been the case. And obviously what we're trying to do is ensure those timelines can be mitigated, given some of the challenges of the longer timelines with Project Optimus.
It's obvious that we have to meet with the FDA and all other health authorities as often as possible. And if in the US you have fast track designation or breakthrough designation, you have a possibility to meet with the FDA more often. And I would take the opportunity to do it, because this is where you're going to learn so much about how they see your particular drug. I think that not only do you meet, but what's important is, are you listening to what the FDA is telling you? And so it is very tempting to go and meet with the FDA or other health authorities and basically think that you know better. And we've seen examples of drugs that have exceptional activity or are designed for a very small, rare tumor, where, Project Optimus might not have been entirely possible for this particular drug, but these are exceptions. And so you should always think about your particular drug in what kind of patient population you're going to develop it, and really listen and implement what the health authority and the FDA in particular is telling you. It is extremely important. And I think listening might actually at the end shorten the development, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. Totally agreed. I know you've seen this more the agency, at least the FDA, will rarely give you a direct, recommendation. They will often give suggestions. But I've certainly seen instances where folks don't take that suggestion as a really strong suggestion. And then you submit your IND and you get a surprise response, right? So I think that's what I'm hearing you guys suggest is these interactions often early, and then if you get even just a hint of a recommendation, that's probably a good suggestion to follow. Perfect. So yeah, Meredith, I can pulling on that thread. This is one thing that, and I don't know that a lot of folks saw this, right? So there's a guidance for the industry that was drafted and published early January 2023, right? Fast forward a year and a half to today, and it actually was finalized in August, about a month and a half ago. I don't know that a lot of folks saw that. There wasn't a lot of fanfare necessarily. The agency doesn't necessarily put out a press release. This is now final, but there were a number of changes, right, from that draft to that final version. And so, kind of what did you see in some of the most, significant changes that stood out to you from reviewing those two different versions?
Yeah, I mean, to start with, I was a little bit surprised at how strong the language was coming out of the FDA. Those of us who spend a lot of time reading guidances, there are often high-level recommendations and strategic things to think about. And to your point, Andrew, they're not going to come out and say, you need to do X, Y, Z. And I really see them doubling down. I mean, I'm personally excited about the guidance because it's really showing that the FDA is concerned about patients and patient-reported outcomes, and really ensuring that the experience is safe and efficacious, but as well as really trying to dig down and understand what some of these patients are dealing with, by doing things as requesting PK/PD plans, which historically a lot of these things were not done in the phase 1 space, and so excuse me. Patient-reported outcomes, large data, more frequent analysis of that data to really understand. Obviously, you see a lot of amendments in phase 1 trials anyway, but I think what we're starting to see is significantly more of those amendments because we're looking at the data real time and ensuring that we're really trying to hone in on an appropriate dose to move forward into expansion.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think there are a number of items in there that we haven't really historically touched certainly in early phase oncology that we'll get into, patient-reported outcomes. Yeah, I agree. We see PK plans and almost real-time PK/PD reporting being much more prevalent. So for those listening, and encourage you, go grab the final guidance, take a look at what changed, and then look for some of that language, like Gilles, you were recommending, where there's really strong language that is basically you should probably do this. Absolutely. All right, perfect. So Joe, I want to kick one over to you right now. So it's really, as an output of Project Optimus, there's really been a shift in study designs, particularly in earlier phases of development. And specifically the sample sizes tied to that, because the agency is asking us to do a lot more optimization, look at different dose levels, different questions earlier, whereas before, right, the maximum tolerated dose paradigm was just 3 or 6 patients and then stop, right? You could run a phase 1 dose escalation study with less than 20 patients in the past. So what have you seen, to the impact of study designs, examples that you've seen from larger global implications? What types of study designs are you running into more often? Would love your flavor on that.
Sure, yeah, Andrew, you're absolutely right. I mean, Project Optimus has completely changed our approach and mindset. I guess the guidance set out to do, no longer the goal of phase 1 studies in oncology to reach a maximum tolerated dose. And in fact, that's the opposite of what we're trying to do now. And so, what I've seen is obviously we've shifted away from the traditional algorithm-based, the 3+3 designs, to now model-based algorithms. And so I think, there's a number of new approaches, but I think the most common one that I see, the most popular one right now, seems to be the Bowen optimal interval design. Bayesian optimal interval design, sorry, or short for Bowen. And so that design really allows, I think, the ability to backfill patients. So, while it increases sample size, you also are able to collect a lot more information. And so I think that in the long run is obviously very helpful to start to hone in on the dose levels that you want to continue to develop. So, of course, this requires additional planning, makes the trial protocol more complicated. And so it requires some more resources, higher numbers of patients. But ultimately, though, I think there's the potential to actually shorten the overall development timeline if you can figure out the optimal dose or doses earlier on. So, Gilles, do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, I agree completely, Joe. I think that, if you attend some of our oncology meeting, ASCO, ACR, ESMO, what you're seeing now in abstracts and posters and presentation is a higher number of patients being enrolled in dose escalation and even more in dose expansion. I think it's very clear, and that results in extending timelines for sure for the first study, first in human, increasing costs, and certainly a demand for more resources. However, this opens up the possibility of doing a little less later on. So if you establish the dose schedule very well in your first study, then you might be able to run a phase 2, a pivotal, or phase 3 study much faster. I can give you the example of Enhertu in breast cancer, which was the first indication that was approved there. And of course, Enhertu is an ADC with a lot of activity, was very, has a lot of data in the study, dose escalation expansion. However, at the time, Optimus didn't exist per se. However, the discussion with the FDA were very clear. You need to better establish dose and schedule. And following the first in human study where we had exciting data, we also had two potential doses, 5.4 mg per kg and 6.4 mg per kg. And wasn't clear which one we were going to bring ultimately in other studies. So what we did is in the second study, the phase 2 study in HER2 positive breast cancer, we actually randomized patients as a first step between different doses, in this case 7.4, 6.4, and 5.4. For PK reasons, there were some CMC changes there to ultimately drop 2 doses during this development and then finish off with a single dose. And that particular study actually was the pivotal study that got us our accelerated registration. So overall, by following what the FDA guidance was, we were able to actually get the drug approved within 4 years after the first patient was entered in the first phase 1. So that's possible to accelerate. But again, exceptional drug, very excited investigator all over the world, so it may be an exception. But again, think about maybe investing more at the beginning into the dose escalation, dose expansion, and then possibly accelerating later on. It's a different paradigm, I think, that's what we're used to.
Totally agree, Gilles. I think that, I don't know about you guys, I've certainly felt like the phase 2 kind of doesn't exist anymore, right? There's phase 1, 2, and to your point, Gilles, you can do these much larger sample sizes, kind of dose escalation, dose optimization, dose expansion. And basically, you could even do all of it in one protocol these days. There's plenty of precedent for that. But you no longer have to then stop after your safety and your dose selection, run a separate phase 2, and then run a separate phase 3 registrational study. It's pretty common to do your kind of proof of concept and then your registration. as two distinct steps. And I agreed that if you invest more earlier, and what we're seeing is these larger sample sizes as a result, which carries with it additional costs, right? That's a whole separate topic I think we'd love to dig into. You then effectively can shortcut the latter stages of development because you've done all that optimization work early. Is that kind of what you're seeing as recent trends?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we were recently at ESMO and look at the phase one. They're getting larger and larger, but you get more information, and not only on safety, but also on efficacy to select the right dose for the patient for later on. And as you mentioned earlier, we're doing more and more of those really, TKIs and different agents that you may not need to use as high a dose as with chemotherapy, for example.
Right.
ADCs are kind of in between. They are targeted treatments, but they do have a chemotherapy in there. And so it's a little tricky when you develop ADCs, but you should be able to follow the same thinking.
Perfect. So, and escalation design, Bowen, Sheila, is that what you're seeing pretty regularly? Joe, sounded like you said the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Boeing is very common and gives you flexibility also. You enroll 3 patients, for example, you get 1 DLT, you increase to 6, you can increase to 9, and there are many decision points in this design. Now, Bowen can be used for single agent, but can also be used for combination when you ultimately get there. So these newer design, I think, are quite appealing because it gives you flexibility to really look at different dosage schedule.
Perfect. Meredith, have you seen any other kind of newer adaptive versions coming out lately?
It's
I've run
pretty
across
consistent.
versions of Bowen. Yeah, they're all kind of similar.
Yeah. That kind of Boeing standard, with some adaptations, but they're all very similar in that regard, so nothing kind of outlandish or off the wall.
Perfect. And the nice thing is that although adaptive in nature, it is still operationally straightforward because all of the if-thens are written into your protocol. From a site perspective or a ClinOps perspective, you're not having to go call the statistician every single time a patient shows up. Those truly adaptive Bayesian designs, those are what I think have historically just been a little bit scary for the industry because they're more complicated. All right, perfect. I love that the focus of this initiative is really on the patient. I think that's, to me, the biggest impact is the agency is saying, let's pay attention to the patient. So let's hone in on that. Meredith, you mentioned patient-reported outcomes. Gilles, have you seen other pieces like in the guidance they talk about diversity, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? There's a whole separate guidance that the agency put out around that people need to then go kind of cross-link to and reference. But what have you seen tied to Project Optimus that's really pulling in more of this patient-centric approach?
Well, it's clear that diversity and inclusion have become something extremely important in clinical trials, not only in the US, but elsewhere. I think that you have to remember other countries are requesting the same thing. When you think about Japanese authorities or Chinese authorities, they want to see as your package patients from their own countries because the PK may be different because of all sorts of reasons. So it makes sense. It's a principle that makes sense that you're going to study your drug in the patient population that ultimately is likely to receive it. And so it makes a lot of sense. Let's take gastric cancer, for example. Gastric cancer is a tumor that's quite frequent in Asia in particular, and is mostly located in the stomach, while on the Western front in the US and Europe, this is mostly GE junction. So you have the same cancer, but localized differently. And the treatments used in Asia in terms of surgery, for example, and early detection are quite different from the Western population. So it makes sense when you filed that the authorities want to see, a disease that is actually the disease they have in their own population. And and we've seen in the past the FDA rejecting certain findings because they were done in patients that may not necessarily represent the US population. So that becomes extremely, extremely important. I think that you mentioned also patient-reported outcomes. Of course, this has become, for many years now, something that we need to collect. Not only do you have to figure out what the safety profile is, but what is the impact on your drug on the life of the patient? And we've been collecting data over the years, and hasn't made it much into the labels of the different cancer agents we have. But I think in the future, there's a chance that it will, because it's becoming more and more important. The science as we improve there, and how to analyze the data, I think, has also improved. So Meredith, I don't want to cut you off, but any other additional thinking here?
No, I mean, I think your answer is great and spot on, Gilles. There's a lot of newer technologies and newer things to think about with DEI and patient-reported outcomes. While a lot of this is not necessarily being kind of fully integrated and required in that first-in-human space, it's something that I think that we're definitely moving towards. As Andrew mentioned, we do have the DEI inclusion guidance as well. And as we start to think about, especially the complex asset types and indication types that we're coming up with, to your point, you do have to have more of that global reach and understanding in order to ensure that, your requirements are being aligned in the end. So when you come back with that data set, you kind of got out of it what you expected.
Yeah, I can just share from what we see on the catalyst side, right? If you think about, I always say I get the lovely benefit of seeing every oncology protocol that comes across our desk. So when you think about that as a pipeline, it's actually pretty substantial. We're talking hundreds of studies a year. Although in the guidance they do talk about patient-reported outcomes and DEI, I can at least share earlier stages of development. It still seems to be status quo for the large part. We're collecting some exploratory endpoints around patient quality of life, some of the standard stuff for oncology. None of it's overly complex anyway. However, DEI piece, there's a recent guidance that my read of that is where the agency effectively says, if you are running a registrational trial, if you're running a trial with registrational intent, you are now required to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. This is predominantly for the sponsors and also for sites that we're seeing, but I think just worth noting that it's mentioned in the Project Optimus guidance, which then links to other guidance, and there's a recent one which was pretty firm language, in my opinion, saying you now have to do this, and we're no longer just going to let you maybe collect this information or think about it post-approval. It is something that they absolutely want to see, which I think is great. It follows the trend on let's think about the patient's experience, right? This drug may be helping, but are they horribly sick, right? Gilles and Joe, the history with some ADCs is, right, the ocular toxicity was a major issue, right? If you can't see, what's the point of taking a drug that helps your cancer? So I'm excited that the agency is really putting their foot down on some of these pieces, and especially on the diversity component. We know we've got to do a better job of getting better access to patients that are underserved communities. Just because something works in a certain population, which is predominantly one group in clinical trials, we don't always see that play out in real world evidence. So it's exciting to see that push. I think earlier phases of development, there's still limited information we're collecting, but for registration, you better be thinking about it, is definitely the answer. All right, perfect.
Andrew, just a quick comment on diversity. First of all, certain populations have more aggressive disease, and so we need to think about that. But second, I think from an operational point of view, this is a real challenge for most of us, because opening a site in a particular city or particular area will not necessarily give you the diversity of patients that you need. There's really more work to be done there. There's a lot of initiatives right now in the industry to try to improve, but it is a real challenge for us. Don't think that opening a site at one place will solve all your issues.
Good point. And I agree that has largely been people's approach so far. So just because we're opening a site that's got perhaps more urban encaptured area doesn't necessarily get you that true representation of patients. Good points. Joe, I mean, tied to patient-reported outcomes. Joe, I know you're a tech guy, right? So what have you seen on the technology front, right? Newer technologies that I think play into Project Optimus and some of the recommendations that the agency's making there?
Yeah, I think with Optimus, there's an increased amount of data, both volume and the speed at which data is coming in. So from a technology standpoint, I think some of the lower lying fruit would be like direct eSource or some kind of EHR to EDC connectors, so that we can gather the data more quickly, timely, but importantly, direct data capture eliminates the need for manual, laborious, and error-prone data transcription or data entry, right? And also that can save time with reducing the amount of source data verification. So to me, I think that's something that I'm a huge proponent of. To be able to get to the data faster, as Meredith and Gilles both said, we have to make the benefit of enrolling more patients earlier on is that you get more data, but then you have to be able to analyze it quickly in real time. And another tool, there are lots of data visualization tools now, and I think that's also extremely helpful in making more real-time decisions on dose levels and backfilling and informing just the whole dose optimization process.
Perfect. Yeah, are you seeing that become more relevant even in the earliest stages of development? I mean, a lot of the times they were kind of thought of as nice to haves, right?
Yeah.
But
there's definitely some room for improvement. There are some early adopters, and it's not perfect by any means. Not all of the data, unstructured data, I think still has a way to go before we can directly capture that. But there are innovative oncology centers that actually now require the use of this technology. So I think,
yeah. Is that a plug for a webinar we did earlier this year, Joe? Yes, agreed. I love that some sites are just putting their foot down and saying, if you want to work with us, you have to use some of these newer technologies that take the burden off of, honestly, some really archaic methods. We still have people physically sitting at a desk copying data over from one screen to another. It makes no sense. And then certainly patient-reported outcomes, if we can collect that in a more seamless way, e-consent. Have you used that yet, Joe? Have you seen that? Is that really helping on some trials?
I have not implemented it yet. We always consider it, but usually the cost to set it up for a first in human doesn't quite justify it. But I'm curious. Yeah, I'd like to try it.
Agreed. But that's probably a perfect segue. I really wanted to dig into cost, right? Because we've been talking about new innovations, larger sample sizes. Gilles, you were talking about it's definitely a more global development paradigm now. Even in first in human, you've got to think beyond for a lot of US-based sponsors, the history has typically been you start in the US and then you think about outside of the US for perhaps expansion or later phases of development. Joe, there's lots of funding coming from other sources where there's a desire to run clinical trials in multiple regions right out of the gate, right? So perhaps Meredith, let's start, because the earliest stages, preclinical side of things, what have you seen? There's really a cost implication of all of this. How are you seeing that play out?
Cost implication. Yeah, it's been interesting, Andrew. I've done a couple of roundtables this year, specifically around Project Optimus, and it's often attended by small to mid-sized biotechs, and there is a lot of frustration. I think that everyone understands this is something we need to do, a direction that's critical. Clearly everyone wants to help patients, but it really breaks the paradigm that we've had historically, where you can get some certain amount of funding that is not as significant as what we're looking at now, and be able to get through your phase 1 and potentially farther. And with the funding challenges we've had over the last couple of years on top of that, I have people that come to me and say, how are we supposed to be able to do this as a small company? Big pharma has, unlimited funds, but we don't. And so thinking of creative ways to ensure that you're designing the study efficiently, but then really working with the team, Catalyst, or whichever CRO you end up using, and trying to come up with creative commercial terms that may help facilitate that interaction as you move through the process. And the design in and of itself lends itself to that, given that you're doing some of these more frequent data cuts and potentially amending and then looking at things in different ways as you move through.
Yeah, it's clear that all these recent changes have increased, the funding that is needed, the resources, the need for higher early financing is clear now, and that's difficult. Okay, we had 2 bad years recently for financing. Maybe it's opening now a little bit more. The problem is the risk is high. You're enrolling more patients at a higher cost and more resources, but you still don't know if your drug is going to work. It's much easier for people that finance companies to look at clinical data, seeing responses or seeing, tumor growth decrease and things like that, and then invest. But now we're going to ask people to invest even before we have this information. And so that's really, really challenging. So at the end, unfortunately, I think that it may have a negative impact on the development of new drugs, because people may or may not want to, with the risk we have, to go ahead. And so that's the risk overall for the industry, is that needing more money and resources and having more risk, are there going to be people able to support us?
I mean, Joe, have you seen similar where, these studies, because they're larger, often cost more, right? So are there creative ways to address that you've noticed, or if first-in-human studies, kind of breaking them into pieces and chunks?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Traditionally, like in biotech startups, you raise a certain amount of money to either get into the clinic or at least finish your phase 1. And now with the increased cost of that, I think we're starting to see maybe some financing strategies where it's a little bit more gated, even within your phase 1 study. So, you might get tranches of money as you sort of move through stages of the study. So that's maybe one creative way in the interim that small companies can continue the program.
Yeah, agreed. I've certainly seen that, where although a protocol may have escalation, optimization, expansion, combination dosing, the tranches of funding are tied to each of those buckets, and it requires a lot more creative commercial thinking around timing, cash flow, and spend. Because Gilles, your point is right. You can do a lot more earlier on, but you need the money, right? You used to be able to run a phase 1 oncology study for a few $1 million, and that is not the case anymore at all. All right, perfect. I want to hit on another piece that's in the guidance real quick, tied to really around optimization, how you get some of that information, how do you, beyond just safety and efficacy, there's a lot of mention around PK and PD and some of those typical biomarker assessments and assay development. So maybe Joe, over to you, because I know you've seen this space. How are you seeing PK, PD, and other kind of assay development becoming more prevalent in the Project Optimus world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think paramount in the guidance is the dose and exposure response, right? So that's dose response and PK/PD, right? As you mentioned. And traditionally in oncology, the response is synonymous with radiographic response, right? Tumor shrinkage. But that may not be the most sensitive or the best pharmacodynamic endpoint. So companies are obviously looking at other potential biomarkers, blood-based, tissue-based biomarkers, and so I think indirectly the guidance is suggesting or supporting, right, the looking at other endpoints for pharmacodynamic activity to help you select your dose before you, maybe something earlier before you start seeing tumor shrinkage. So, but that in itself is complicated and a costly endeavor as well, right? So it compounds the issue of the funding need.
Agreed. Yeah, Meredith, how about you? You've done a ton of the PK work for sure. Are you seeing that be more explicit?
Yeah, I mean, Joe's totally right. The guidance very clearly says, you really should be including a PK and a PD plan and have to try to build in that level of understanding very early on. And as far as biomarker goes, historically, they weren't done as much, particularly in phase 1, maybe retrospectively or, sort of to do some research later and potentially figure it out, where we're seeing, again, for those same very reasons, to be able to track and understand what's going on more real time, a huge increase in biomarker and assay development, even in that phase 1 space.
Perfect. Well, I have a whole list of other questions. We could talk all day about this, guys, but I know we wanted to get some time for audience questions. And Corey, you mentioned folks may be able to dig in and ask some questions directly to the panel. I wanted to open it up for everyone else that's on the line with us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that discussion, and we'll keep it rolling here through our Q&A portion of the event. As we do so, as Andrew mentioned, I do invite the audience to continue sending your questions or comments. Just a reminder, if you're attending via GoToWebinar, please use the questions chat box. And for those of you watching on LinkedIn Live events, feel free to post your questions using the comments tab. We already have received some from the audience, and I'm sure we'll continue to receive some as we go through this Q&A session. So just a note that if we don't have time to get to your questions, the team will have a chance to follow up with you after the webinar, and there will be some contact information where you can reach out after the webinar as well. One of the questions that's come on from the audience already here is an interesting one. The audience member was asking about what is the optimal sample size or even an approximate number of patients that companies should be thinking about when comparing doses to meet the FDA's expectations. And then I guess a follow-up on that, does this need to be done in a randomized fashion, or do you think the FDA would accept expansion of an existing dose escalation cohort to achieve the same goal? I'll open that up to the panel, and maybe we can get some comments from everyone on that one.
I see that. I hear that question every day, but maybe we'll go to the folks who are on the developing in real time. Gilles, we'll start with you, right? How have you seen that play out?
Well, of course, for those of you that have met the FDA, you will never get a number. So it's always going to be a difficult discussion, but it is clear in the guidance, if you read it carefully, that they're not asking for a statistical significant difference between, the two doses. So that has to be said. So you're not necessarily going to power, if you do a randomized study, the randomization. Now, is it better to do randomized versus parallel cohorts? Always better to randomize. Patients could be different if you don't randomize from one arm to the other, and you may get very, very strange results or not. And so it's always preferable to randomize, and that's what I think the FDA would like. But Joe or Meredith, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree. Agency is not going to agree to a number, but as you you said, Gilles, they do mention that it does not need to be statistically powered. But I think we're seeing a lot of companies in the 20 to 30 patients per time point, or sorry, per dose level as an initial start. And of course, randomized is ideal. And I'm not sure if there's any experience with filing on selecting a dose for registration based on that type of sample size, but that's what I think we're seeing though. Companies, sort of the balance between the affordability and getting enough data.
How about you, Meredith? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, the same thing, right? I mean, those numbers are, about what we're seeing. And, yes, the FDA will never tell you. And so for me, it feels, again, like the FDA is really going back to, what are we seeing from a patient perspective, from an outcome perspective, and being able to utilize biomarkers and PK to understand that better without saying, this is statistically what you need to see.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and just because I like helping with kind of future planning and just hey, how much money and time do we have to just set aside for a phase 1/2 study now? I feel like it's hard to get a firm number, but it's pretty common. If you have a Bowen design for dose escalation, you can see upwards, and dose optimization where you're backfilling patients as part of that. You can see upwards of 50 to 60 patients in that kind of phase 1/2 escalation optimization stage. And then expansion, I've honestly seen about half and half, where protocols either do enough optimization and backfill or randomize between 2 dose levels in expansion. And so you kind of have to pick. It's probably the same ultimate number of patients. You just have to choose where, based on your drug or your mechanism of action, you think where that's best done. But the expansion is off. The randomization, yeah, there's no statistical power. So statisticians go nuts over this. They're like, why are we randomizing? There's nothing behind it. Typically 10 to 20 patients for each dose level. And then you can have a Simon 2-stage design where you make a call based on futility, or if you see enough responses, you keep going to randomize even further. But phase 1/2 trials now are all in, or well over 100 patients. There's a lot of precedent for doing that.
And just one additional note, Andrew. This randomization has to be done on specific tumor types. So if you have a range of tumor types, it is preferable that you do some randomization in each and every tumor type, believe it or not, because the FDA might see differences. And we've seen, for example, in ADCs, that the dose required, for example, in gastric cancer, it's higher because the exposure is lower in gastric cancer than breast cancer, for example. And so that's a typical example where you don't have the same dose with the same drug, but on different tumor types. So something to think about as well. If you do a clinical trial in lung cancer and all the patients have the same, exact baseline characteristics, then that's you do it only once.
Agreed. Or I've certainly heard where you have to just pay now or pay later, right? At some point, you're going to have to show the optimization in some form of randomization. So either bake it into your phase 1/2 design, or you may be asked to do it later when you're talking registration, which will be a larger sample size. So it may ultimately be better to do it early, which again has extra cost and time implications. But if you've got the funding, then go for it.
Great, thanks everyone for your response to that. And Gilles, you just started bringing up ADCs in your response there, and that actually is a great segue to another question that we received here from the audience. You talked a little bit about size, but I wonder if we could expand upon, is there any difference in implementing Project Optimus for small molecules or ADCs versus immunotherapy like antibodies or CAR T cells? Could we maybe expand on the differences there?
I can start, but just quickly saying that we have to apply Optimus in all the different, targeted agents. I think that as we talked a little bit before, if you're lucky enough to have a biomarker, and often that's not the case, but if you have, then that becomes extremely useful in determining, your PK/PD and your relationship with exposure safety and exposure efficacy. But Joe, I think you are the one mentioning also the biomarkers as well and the importance of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as much as you know about your drug, the target, and purported, sort of mechanism of action, I think, that all of that will be important to help select the optimal dose or dosage. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great, excellent, thank you.
Worth note, real quick, Corey. Worth just noting the guidance does explicitly state that it does not apply to cell therapies.
Yeah, that's what's exactly.
Although I agree with everybody that it's still, at least the CAR T and the other like TIL-based protocols I've seen are still largely following the same paradigm for designs.
So actually on that kind of topic of, where it may not apply, we've got another question here that I think is really interesting. It's asking how dose optimization is executed in rare diseases. So are there any expectations or requirements made in these situations?
Well, I worked in rare diseases before a little bit, and this is a different animal. As I mentioned earlier, when you have a rare disease, it's already very difficult to find those patients. So they become extremely precious patients for dose escalation and dose determination. So you have to find ways to actually use the patients you have in the best way possible. Often in rare diseases, you don't have to conduct large randomized phase 3 studies. And so you may have to spend a little bit more time at the beginning to establish the dose correctly before to go to a pivotal study. I don't know if others have experience in rare disease here.
Well,
Yeah,
by
I mean,
definition, a lot of oncology indications are rare, right? So I think especially when we're talking about biomarker selective populations or subgroups of larger indications, I mean, there's a lot of crossover between oncology and rare disease, and I think your point's spot on, Gilles, that they're very, these patients are precious. We're often dealing with enrollment rates that are, 0.0 something, right? One patient per site per year. And that's where we've got to be really mindful about optimizing it without really spending up too much of that precious resource. Sorry, Meredith, I cut you off there.
No, that's fine. And I agree. And I think one of the things I'm seeing more of on the earlier side in the consulting is that we're having much earlier conversations around feasibility and understanding, particularly with some of these rare patient populations. So you can try to integrate that into your design early and upfront and get a better understanding, so that you're not kind of rolling into this project and unable to either find patients or, what you've designed is not necessarily going to be realistic based on what you're seeing globally from a patient population standpoint.
I would strongly suggest to communicate with the FDA and discuss your specific issue if you're facing a rare disease development.
I think that's just being mindful of time here, I think that's a really nice sentiment to end on. Strongly communicate with the FDA, famous words from Gilles Gallant as we'll close out our webinar here today. Thank you everyone for asking your questions and sending them in for a Q&A period. As I mentioned, if we didn't have time to hit your question, or if you have any further questions, or if you're someone who is watching the recording of this webinar, you can get in touch with the team at Catalyst Oncology using the email address currently up on screen, and they'll have a chance to follow up with you after the event, and they'll get a whole list of your questions as well, so they'll have a chance to follow up on that. I do thank everyone once again for participating today. If you are attending via GoToWebinar, please don't forget to download the supporting materials that you see in the handouts module. Andrew mentioned them earlier off the top, that we have a lot of great documentation that you can walk away from the webinar with today. And I've also added a link in the chat box where you'll be able to view the recording of this event. You can share this link with your colleagues so that they may register to view it as well. And you'll also be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks. And after we wrap things up here, a survey window will appear on your screen. Your participation in the survey is always appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. For those of you watching on LinkedIn Live, we do encourage you to create an account on xtalks.com and register for this event, which will then give you access to not only today's recording, but to our other upcoming webinars. Speaking of which, we do have another webinar coming up from Catalyst. I'd just like to mention that they have a next webinar on October 31st, and this one is entitling Leveraging Functional Service Providers for Enhanced Efficiency in Drug Development. And you can absolutely go ahead and register for that one on xtalks.com or by using the second link that I've added into the GoToWebinar chat box. Now, please join me once again in thanking our speakers once more for their excellent discussion. Andrew, Meredith, Gilles, and Joe, really appreciated having you here today. We thank you so much for your time. We hope our audience found this informative, and we wish you all a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.